Morning everybody, I'm going to go over how to answer this essay question for 20 marks, which is about evaluate the view that another recession is inevitable in the UK. The first thing to say here is after the question it says extract A line 24, and they're referring you to this section, particularly in this extract. This is line 24. And we need to remember that this is an old-style question. When you actually get your essay question in the exam, at the end of AS, it would be a 20-mark question like this, and then at the end of A-level, you're going to be getting a 25-mark question. But you won't actually be writing it in response to some data. So just to know that this is the old-style question, okay? And your question, you won't have data that you're responding to when you answer it. Anyway, going back to this question, just for the practice. So the fact that it says evaluate, we need to make sure that we have a judgment at the end. And they're saying that another recession is inevitable in the UK. So really, the structure of your answer, you need to start off with a definition of what a recession is. So that's 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. And then after that, really, you need to try and put in a diagram. Because if you put a diagram into your essay question, you are awarded more marks, it appears. It seems a bit silly sometimes if it's not particularly relevant, but a diagram here would be good. You could do a diagram showing this trade cycle, or you could do a diagram showing aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and you could show aggregate demand going down and that causing the recession possibly. So some kind of diagram, and remember to integrate it into your answer. So that means that you need to talk about it in your answer. I'm not going to draw you that diagram now, because in this instance, it isn't very, very key. But as I say, you should always try and put a diagram into your essay because you will get more marks for that. So what you need to do is you need to look in the data and you need to find out the reasons why they thought the recession is inevitable. And your structure is going to be to say, yes, inevitable. And then the sort of counter argument just to say no, that it's not inevitable. And perhaps it won't happen. And largely you need to be drawing on the data that you've been given. You're not talking about a lot of things which are outside of this. Mostly you want to base your answer on the facts that you've been given in this article. When you come to writing your own essay, you'll be able to use broader things and things that are going on in the real world. But remember that theory needs to be the centre of everything that you're doing, and that's economic theory. So everything needs to hang on economic theory and come from that. Because if you don't base what you're saying on economic theory, you're not showing what you've learned in the course. But remember, it needs to be answering the question at all times. Let's have a look here. It says in this section that they referred you to, the economy did not appear to be rebalancing away from consumer-driven growth towards export-led growth, making another recession almost inevitable. What this is getting at is that there's a very high proportion of aggregate demand in the UK is down to consumption. This is a fact in the UK. Around 65-70% of our AD is just down to consumption. And this is saying that if the whole of the economy is based on consumption and people borrowing money to consume, then if something happens so that suddenly the people can no longer consume, our overall aggregate demand will fall really significantly because we're just relying on one part of it. Interestingly, in China, for example, they rely hugely for their AD on exports, and their government spends a lot of time trying to increase consumption domestically within China because they feel that their AD is overly reliant on exports. So, for example, at the moment, if they're exporting less during the coronavirus, that will mean that their AD really suffers. For us, at the moment, because consumption's gone down significantly, that will really be affecting our aggregate demand. So this is the point being made here, that they're not getting closer to having export-led growth in the UK. The UK isn't exporting enough, and that's what they're trying to do. So when you're talking about, yes, the recession's inevitable, you can talk about the fact that such a high proportion of our AD is dependent on consumption, and the UK isn't increasing their exports sufficiently to be able to make up a bigger part of all of our AD. And if we go back to looking in the extract up here, we can see that the Chancellor had a target for the UK to export $1 trillion of goods and services by 2020, requiring an annual growth rate of 8%, and that the UK exports had reached just 2.7% their growth. And this shows that they're not, so exports are not increasing sufficiently. And that, by the way, here it's looking at goods and services, but it says exports are not increasing sufficiently. And if you look at this paragraph below, it says that exports and services continue to grow. We know this in the UK, we're particularly good at services, but we have less of an emphasis nowadays on goods. As it says here, the UK's goods industries were struggling. And this is another reason you could argue. This links into the point down here about a high proportion of our AD being based on consumption. You can say that even though we are, as a country, trying to increase our exports, it's not working. And we're exporting more services, but we're still struggling with exporting goods. I'm going to carry on looking at the question in one last video.